somebody else coming into the waiting room. Just give me a minute. So welcome to the second half of WAWA CU at the virtual Chinese Family Camp 2021. Tina, just really delighted that you could join us as an old time camper and just, an all around awesome person. Just wanted to say thanks for being with us. I'm just going to get out of the way and just let you do your thing. So share your slides, do your talk, just do your
All
thing.
right.
Really, just thanks for being here.
Well, thanks, Alan. I'm happy to do this. I'm going to, hopefully this will work on the screen sharing thing. I confess, a year and a half into this, and I'm still not very adept on Zoom, even though like I'm on it all day long. But let's see if this will work. Share. Okay, is that working?
So far, so good.
All right, so can you see that? Does it say Wawasee University?
Yep.
Yep.
Yes.
All right. So this is sort of an adaptation of a slideshow that I do when I speak for my different versions of my speaking engagements. And I say that because you will recognize some of it, but it is the story that I kind of tell, when I'm asked to do a lot of speaking things, either about Time's Up or about myself. And so I usually start with this, and you'll recognize these folks as Auntie Lily and Uncle Peter. So I really start by talking about the fact that I am the daughter of Chinese immigrants, but I particularly stress that I'm the daughter of 2 Chinese refugees, because I think in this day and age, it's really important. And also talk about how they were welcomed, right? It took 2 different acts of Congress to get my parents on a path to citizenship. My mom, because I think several of our parents were part of this act of Congress that put all the Chinese students who were in on student visas onto a green card path. And my dad, who was not a student, had to be the subject of some special legislation. But you know what? Unlike what's going on these days, Congress kind of agreed with it and went with it, and that's how my parents became citizens. And I reflect a lot that, like, really only in this country could the daughter of these 2 Chinese refugees in one generation. Oh, no, actually, that's not it. This is the story about my mom. This is like the slide of how she was welcomed. This is like the article that appeared in the Cleveland newspaper when she became a citizen, because unlike what happens these days, she was actually welcomed, and it was a newsworthy in our community that she was a new citizen and both my parents, in the United States, which is like a clipping I found in my parents' scrapbook. But then I said, it's really only in this country where, their daughter in one generation could go back to China on a plane that looked like this. This is actually the, plane that the First Lady travels on when she goes overseas. That's my team, held at the base of the plane after our trip to China. And this, it's really, I sort of can't really say this without choking up, that really only in this country could like that happen in one generation, that I go back to China, representing the president and the first lady of the United States on a plane that looks like this. And then, I talk about like my, here I am in Cleveland, Ohio, as you all know, Sandy and I grew up, outside of Cleveland, Ohio. My dad actually made a deliberate decision to settle us in Ohio. My parents first came to the States, Auntie Dorothy was in New York, and my uncles was in California, and they sort of decided, my dad, not to actually settle in New York or California, because he had heard about stories that other friends and family had experienced in those areas. And he thought that was because of the high concentrations of Chinese in New York and California. So, as I say in my speeches, so he decided to settle us in a place where there were no Chinese at all, in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio. And back in those days, there literally were like 5 or 6 families in all of this eastern side of Cleveland, so in the 50s and 60s. Kathy Coe, his family was one of those. And some of you remember Wayne and Winston Liao. That was another one. And that was kind of it. family, and it's something that he kind of said, this is our suburban childhood. But you all should know that I do this publicly. I've said it to the press. I've said it on numerous public speaking engagements that I talk about camp. I say, even though that's where I was raised, one of the things that my dad did and all of our parents did who put together Chinese family camp was to keep us in touch with our Chinese heritage. This is the slide I use because it was one that I could find, that would sort of show Chinese culture. I think that's Pu in the, Pu and Li inside the Chinese marriage ceremony thing that we made. and I talk a lot about camp, and I will say that the picture that I paint of 200 plus Chinese families descending into central Indiana and Amish country usually gets a chuckle out of folks, because that image and that picture of what we did in all those years is it's just so great as a contrast. But it's a really important, I think, part of my staying in touch with my heritage through my childhood in those circumstances, and an important part of like who I am today. And I always say that this camp has continued in an unbroken string, including in our virtual unbroken string for, the last, 60, what are we up to, Alan? 63?
63, yep.
Yeah, 63 years, which is its own remarkable achievement. I've talked a lot about how I started in gender equity issues, and that had to do with, coming out of college. Married, some of you met my ex-husband back then. There's actually a very funny story about him, and I'll get to in a second. But when we got married coming out of Harvard, we lived in Springfield, Illinois, which in that moment in time, having nothing to do with me, in 1978 happened to be like the hotbed of American feminism. So if you watch Mrs. America, it's where Phyllis Schlafly was located. It became the centerpiece for all the battles going on around Equal Rights Amendment, because we were trying to get it passed through Illinois. Was the only northern industrial state that at that time had not ratified the ERA. And it was viewed as the linchpin to get one of the final 3 states left, is all we had left, to get the ERA into the Constitution before 1981, which was the deadline Congress had set. So, here I am, all of 20 something. These are like some of the marches and rallies that we were at. You can see we're dressed in white and green because those were our colors. I worked for state government in the Capitol building, and I used to take my lunch hour to go down to the rotunda, and we would line up on one side of the rotunda, and the red and white folks, led by Phyllis Schlafly, would line up on the other side, and we'd kind of scream at each other across the rotunda. It was a very heady time, to be in my early 20s and learning about these issues. It was like a crash course in feminism. We had, as the deadline neared in 1982, and we still hadn't ratified, things got very heated. We had a 100,000 person march in Chicago. We had a 10,000 person march in Springfield. We had nuns who went on a hunger strike, and people who came from students from the U of I who came and chained themselves to the doors of the State House, which, in this current environment sounds actually much more, alarming than it was back then. But we didn't get the ERA passed, but it did sort of set me on a path to being dedicated to gender equity issues. The funny story about Larry is the summer we got engaged, which was the summer between my junior and senior years, he had already graduated. I went to visit him in Springfield because he was already there, and he drove me to camp. And we came to camp, and we arrived on Friday night after dinner, but before midnight snack. And my mother had saved a plate of food for us. And so we're down in the bottom of the lodge, eating. And several of you all, I think, maybe Helen, maybe Alan, definitely my sister Sandy, and my cousin Ruth, and Jim Wong, were up in the loft. Remember the loft at the lodge, looking down on us. You could be up in the loft and you could look down on what was happening on the ground floor. And you all were talking all about Larry. And it was reported to me that when he used chopsticks, which by the way was not by accident, he had to practice. But Larry, for those of I should fill in, was a German-Irish guy. So he had practiced how to learn chopsticks before he met my parents. So he used chopsticks unknowingly that all of you guys were up in the loft waiting to sort of see what this new guy that I was, bringing as my fiance would do. So that's sort of a little camp related story. I went on to become a lawyer. So many of you know, I went to law school at Northwestern. After that period, became a corporate litigator, and spent 23 years doing that. Was a single working mom. Larry and I got divorced shortly after Patrick was born. And then I adopted Emma, as you all know, from China. This is actually one of my favorite pictures because this is the moment, literally the moment that Patrick and Emma met. So we have just, Emma and I, this is like pre 9/11. So Patrick was able to be at the gate when we walked off the plane. Auntie Dorothy went with me to China to adopt Emma. So she actually is the one who carried Emma off the plane because I ran out first to see Patrick because we hadn't seen each other for 3 weeks at that point. He is 9 years old in this picture at the time, and Emma is 10 months, almost 11 months old. And it's like just great. It's like just this great picture of the two of them, like instant, brother sister relationship. And then this is how you know them all now, right? This is at Patrick's wedding, which we had, Lawrence knows because Lawrence was there as a block party, on our street. And Patrick wore his dress blues in his Marine uniform. That's his wife, Jen, and Patrick. So they're, here they are all sort of all grown up now 3 years ago. The wedding was in 2018. And then along the way, I, sort of in addition to being a corporate lawyer, I worked on democratic politics and gender equity issues all along the way. Somewhere in doing this democratic politics, long enough ago that the three of us actually don't remember how we met. We've actually tried to reconstruct it and we can't. So I have no cool how did you meet Barack and Michelle Obama story to tell. I was always, supportive of his campaigns, always a friend. And to all of our surprise, which is what this picture is, he becomes president of the United States. It's actually a picture from a state dinner that was taken, but I love it given the looks on their faces. And he became president of the United States, and he asked me to join him in the White House, which, this is, Emma's 12 years old in the middle of 6th grade. I'm sort of pretty happy in my legal career. I've got this great house in Chicago that I love. And, it's a little disruptive. I remember thinking, okay, am I really going to move halfway across the country? But, the president of the United States doesn't ask you to go work in the White House very often. And you sort of feel like you should support the president, which I wanted to do for him. So I went in, really right away in January 2009. My first job was to be the director of the Office of Public Engagement, which was his outreach office. This actually, interestingly, I think is a meeting in what's known as the Roosevelt Room with a lot of API leaders, because I recognize who's kind of around the table. The Office of Public Engagement was the name of the office. It really is the office that was responsible for reaching out to all the different ethnic groups, women's groups, business groups. I remember when I got the job, the guy who had held a similar position in the Bush administration was working for one of my clients, and he very lovely and gracious offered to come over and sit down with me and explain things. Because look, remember, I'm going in this office. Other than the tour I took when I was in 8th grade, I hadn't even stepped foot in the White House, right? So I had no idea what it was going to be like. And I remember this guy saying, with due respect to folks on the call who may be Republicans, he did say to me, he said, well, I was really curious how they organized the office because I didn't know how I was going to organize my office. And I said, what was your structure? And, what deputies did you have? He said, well, we had 2 deputies. I was one of them. I was the deputy for business. And then I had a colleague who was the deputy for faith groups and conservative groups. And that was it. I said, that's it. I said, okay, so we're Democrats and we have lots more constituency groups we have to talk to. And indeed, when I made the list, it's 60. They broke down to 60 different groups when you break it down to African Americans, Latinx, women, LGBTQ, health groups, business groups, students, Native American, go down the list. It was, 60 plus of constituency groups, which we needed to reach out to. Remember, this is 2009, and we had just come off of the most technologically advanced campaign up until that point. And yet we walked into a White House where literally there were 16 laptops in existence throughout the whole White House. My poor team was using Excel spreadsheets to send and track all these groups that they had. We subsequently, modernized, obviously, the computer system, but I will say that Rahm Emanuel, you'll remember, was our first chief of staff, passed out those 16 laptops based on whether you had children or not. So that was a little bit of a family-friendly, effort. I got to do obviously really cool things in the outreach office. This is one of them. And you may remember in May of that year, so about 5 months later, the president nominated his first, nominee to the Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor. And this is me on the Tuesday after Memorial Day, escorting soon to be Justice Sotomayor and the president from the Oval Office. We have just walked out. Those doors that you see there are the doors to the Oval Office. We're walking out into the colonnade. About the Rose Garden is over, to the side where the bushes are. About to walk down past that famous colonnade that, Jack Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were photographed in, on our way to the East Room to announce and introduce Sonia Sotomayor to the rest of the country. I remember the date quite vividly because we didn't know. There's all this speculation about, who was he going to pick? When was it going to get picked? And about Saturday, Memorial Day weekend, I get this call saying, okay, you have to get people to the White House on Tuesday at 10 o'clock, but you cannot tell them why. And, here's who, some of the people you might want to have, but Tina, you should figure out who else you need to have in the room. I'm like, okay, but, some of the people had to fly in. I can't tell them why. And you need to get people's, security information to let them onto the White House grounds. It's not that easy. This is in the early days when the people, the chief of staff was kind of thinking it's easy just to get people onto the White House grounds. It's really not. So we had to sort of cobble this together over Memorial Day weekend, unveil this thing without telling people why they were coming to the White House at 10 o'clock. Luckily, when you say you want to come to the White House, people usually say yes, but that was what we were able to do. I also, from the sublime to the ridiculous, in addition to organizing events for people like a, Supreme Court justice, it was also my job to organize the very famous beer summit. That is what this is. You will recall, again, in 2009, there was this moment where, Professor Henry Gates, who is, on the left there, was arrested by a Cambridge police officer, the guy who's in the middle there, whose name I'm now forgetting, because Professor Gates was actually trying to get into his own house, having forgotten the house keys for his own house. But he's trying to break into, climb through the window to get into his own house. He's arrested by the Cambridge police. Think about this. This is 2009, after the year we've just went through around police actions. And this is sort of an early sign of how often this actually has happened, especially for Black Americans. And this became a fairly tense thing. And what the president did to sort of actually show that we could, have a rapprochement and dialogue among everybody, the idea was to have a beer summit. That's what this is, on the corner of the Rose Garden. My task, one of the more complicated tasks that day, was to figure out what everyone's beer choice was and to get that inside the White House in time for this. And I remember Gates had like some really weird choice, like, it was a Sam Adams Light. There is nothing called a Sam Adams Light. Like, at that time, Sam Adams did not make a light beer. So we had to sort of figure it out and make it up. Again, getting beer into the White House isn't what you usually do. So I sort of remember Secret Service was sort of wondering what we're doing when we're bringing it through the security gates. And then the other thing that I did, in addition to being the head of the Office of Public Engagement, was to run the White House Council of Women and Girls. So you'll recall that obviously gender equity issues was a passion of mine. And so when I took the job, I did say to Valerie, to the president, well, I want to keep outreach to women's organizations for myself. I want to make sure we can keep working on those issues. Valerie and I worked with the president to put together this executive order. That's what he's signing right there in that photo on March 9th of 2009 to create the White House Council of Women and Girls, his first ever effort of every cabinet agency and every White House policy office. Valerie was the chair. I was the executive director for all 8 years, to really do women's policy, women and girls policy across the whole federal government, domestic and international, within the agencies and across agencies. I'm proud to say it kind of went away, obviously, in the next administration, but the Biden administration has brought it back. They've actually expanded it. We now call it the Gender Policy Council. One of my former Time's Up staffers is now the executive director of it. And they're continuing the work there. The first bill we signed, in keeping with the theme of gender equity, this is a picture of the President Obama signing the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which was the very first bill he signed in his administration. This happened literally in the first week after Inauguration Day. I think it was maybe 6 days after Inauguration Day. Again, in this particular idea of this, as running the Office of Public Engagement, I was responsible for organizing this bill signing. Again, we had never done an event. It was the first large event the Obama administration held inside the White House. We literally didn't know how to do it. We didn't know where it was. I remember somebody saying, you're going to do it in the East Room. And I'm like, how do I get to the East Room? We would make no idea. When I think back, it's a miracle this thing happened as well as it did, and that we got everybody in. But it was, when I think back, how little we knew. But this has become obviously a really iconic moment for the Obama administration. And then we also, keeping with gender equity issues, did, amazing things on celebrating how we were across the entire administration integrating women. And I'm really proud of the fact that one of the things that happened in our administration was the full integration of women into the military. When we started, there were especially combat duty positions were closed to women in the military. And the problem with keeping those closed to women is that then they can't advance, because the way in which you advance is by doing combat missions and holding combat ranks and officer positions. And women, that was closed to women forever. They had never been opened to women. And it was especially notable for me because back when I was doing the ERA work, if you remember that slide, one of the big things that killed the ERA in sort of 1982 in Illinois was the specter of women serving in the military. We had just come out of the Vietnam War, and Phyllis Schlafly was saying, all your daughters are going to have to be drafted and go to the military. And this idea that women would serve in combat in the military was viewed in 1982 as so toxic, it killed an amendment to the Constitution. Well, by the time you get to, fast forward, 2009, 10, 11, I'm proud to say it kind of just happened without any controversy at all. And the first step to full integration of women in the military was done by this guy standing next to President Obama, Secretary Ray Mabus, who I'm a big fan of. He was our Secretary of the Navy. He's the former governor of Mississippi, one of the first Southern politicians to endorse then candidate Obama in 2008. And Ray actually sent a letter to Congress, which is required to do, saying, I'm opening the ranks of submarine officers to women. He did it very early on in 2009. And it caused nary a ripple. Like, you probably don't even know that happened, because in contrast to what happened in 1982, like, no one even noticed. And I so loved that I kept wanting to bring the submarine officers in. Because actually submarine officers are to the Navy what fighter pilots are to the Air Force, I learned. They are the cream of the crop. One of the stories I was told, which I don't know if it's true, is one of the reasons that helped fuel and get the Navy's support for the decision to open the ranks is they are so cream of the crop, is that they pride themselves on taking the top 10% of the Naval Academy graduating class every year to be submarine officers. And they couldn't keep doing that unless they opened it to women, because women occupied so much of the top 10% of the naval graduating class, which is a story I love. And I kept getting told, and now I know it because I watched Patrick, what Patrick goes through in this course, he's had to go through to become a Marine officer. I now understand it, but they kept telling me, wait, they've got to go through this training and then this training. And there's still a weeding out that happens, through the course of their training. And so when they were finally through it, they'd been all gotten their officer status, their lieutenant status, and they're assigned to a submarine. They came to the White House. And this is the moment where those submarine officers, I think this happened in 2011, came to the White House with Secretary of Defense Panetta and the President, Mrs. Obama, and Secretary Mabus. So I love that story, and I love these women. This is one of my other favorite events. This actually happened not until 2016, but as a former Girl Scout, and I think there's other Girl Scouts, in at camp, and because we love a campfire at camp too, right? Given that this is family camp and our old campfires, the Girl Scouts always wanted to do a sleepover at the White House. They thought that would be really cool. Well, it took me the entire 8 years to figure out how to make that happen with Secret Service, because it's a little complicated, like having a bunch of girls tented out on the South Lawn of the White House and doing things like campfires and things. It's not exactly something Secret Service warmed up to or could figure out, but we did. Finally, in 2016, we figured it out. You can see that's our campfire, right? So there's no fire. There's actually just little battery operated lamps sitting around the middle. So that's supposed to replicate the campfire that they're singing around, singing in. The aftermath to the story is, we have this lovely event. The press comes out. They take this picture with the president and the first lady. We're promoting Girl Scouts. They go to sleep in their tents. We actually had a People magazine reporter embedded with them to spend the night with them. And literally at 2:00 in the morning, the heavens opened and we had one of those DeRocha horrible accelerated thunderstorms in which everyone had to get quickly evacuated. The tents are flying around the south lawn. We had to get them all inside a building. My team actually had a rain plan. So luckily we were able to do that. But that's kind of how that event ended, because one of the things you never know, you have to always be prepared for anything. And then this relates to my current work at Time's Up. One of the things we did was to put on the first ever White House Summit on Working Families, which we did in 2014 to promote issues like getting more women into the workplace, issues like equal pay and paid leave, and flexible working schedules for working women. This is just, sort of sitting on the colonnade, myself and the president and the first lady I can't actually remember what we were doing or talking about, but it didn't happen very often that we would see him during the day. I will say that, I think this is there's another sort of funny version of this photo that's out there of us sort of clowning around on the colonnade, because it would be very unusual that we would run into him in the middle of the day. I think we were coming across the building to go back to our offices in the East Wing. I will say, and Mrs. Obama writes about this in her book, and I will share that the one day he asked for us to go to the Oval really only happened on this one occasion, where out of the blue, unplanned, I got a message in the middle of the day that the president wanted to see the first lady. And we had just come back at that moment from our annual Christmas visit to the National Children's Hospital in DC. And she was speaking at an event over in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. So not on the residence side in the East Wing, but through the building over in that, wedding cake building that is across the driveway from the main part of the White House. And I got the message that he wanted to see her, and in conjunction with the message about the shooting at Sandy Hook. And so I learned about the shooting at Sandy Hook that way. She was about to go out and speak, and I made the determination not to tell her about Sandy Hook until she was done doing with her press event and her public speaking event. It was an auditorium full of people, and the press was there. I waited till the end of it to tell her then in the green room behind that speaking what had happened, and that the president had asked to see her in the Oval. And so we walked back, through the West Wing to the Oval, where he just needed to see her, because what I now know, which I didn't know then, is not only had the president been told about Sandy Hook, but he had the early FBI photos from inside the school and of what had happened. And you may remember then he went out to the press room podium to talk about that. And this is the one where he really, couldn't get through his prepared remarks, because as parents, I think that particular day really shook all of us. It shakes me to this day to remember that day as particularly terrible. This is us this gives you a view of what the First Lady's office is like. So we had this is her office in the East Wing, where we would meet with her. Behind my shoulder, you'll see two things that are interesting. One is that thing that's got all those little items on it, is what's known as a challenge coin podium. And challenge coins are, for those of you who know about the military, is a coin that you give as a sign of respect to someone, and it's usually, the coins are beautiful, they're different designs, and usually representing the unit of the military that somebody's in. People have them. My first challenge coin came from Speaker Pelosi, who gave me one. So, different people in Washington will have challenge coins. The president and the first lady each had a challenge coin they would give out. So those are the challenge coins Mrs. Obama had. The other thing you see over my shoulder is the bottom part of a teleprompter. And that is because Mrs. Obama is an incredible planner and practices ahead. And whenever she would give a major speech, we had a teleprompter set up in the office so that she would practice them. She deliberately would stand at a podium, stand in front of the prompter. We'd run the speech through multiple times. That's how we also did edits, because we could see whether something that looked good on paper didn't sound good actually getting spoken out loud. She practiced pronunciations. So we always had sort of a teleprompter at hand in her office. Christmas time, this is just a photo, it was a special time. This is from my Gold Star tree that we always had at Christmas for our decorations of, where folks could, put the names of the loved one in the military that they had lost to remember. And it was the first tree that you saw when you came in the White House, if you came on one of the Christmas tours or for a Christmas party at the White House. We would unveil our Christmas decorations every year. I mean, if you've ever watched the HGTV special on the Christmas decorations, it's like a whole thing. I got to tell you, the Christmas decorations every year, and they're done by volunteers. So our Christmas decorations are done by volunteers from all 50 states. People apply to do it. They literally give up their Thanksgiving vacations, because they have to come in, and the first meeting for decorating is Thanksgiving night. And then they work through that weekend, and we unveil the decorations the Wednesday after Thanksgiving. And then we would always do it with military families and kids as being the first people to see the Christmas decorations. And in this particular moment, we have an event where the kids would come and they would go to the state dining room with our pastry chefs and folks to make gifts for their family in front of the press. So the press is, you can see over to the right-hand side of the photo. This is the only time I swear that one of the dogs knocked a kid down, but that is Sunny, the younger of the two dogs. And Sunny is knocking this little girl down, but I will tell you, she's perfectly fine because the guy who's laughing in uniform over Mrs. Obama's shoulder is her father. So he's just standing there laughing, watching his daughter go. She was fine. She was totally fine. We got to meet lots of famous people, obviously, which was a fun treat. This is the Canada State Dinner from 2016, the only state dinner that Sasha and Malia came to. And what we would do for our state dinners is we would invite, famous, Americans or Canadians who, for this instance, who, were leaders, artists or business leaders who had a connection to the country that we were hosting. So Ryan Reynolds, some of you may know, is Canadian. So he got to come, and you can see Sasha and Malia were kind of excited to meet him. Billie Jean King was one of the first celebrities I was able to escort into the Oval Office to meet the president. I think this is the first time we took her in. I actually lost her on the way to this. We had lunch beforehand in the Navy mess. It was my responsibility to escort Billie Jean in. This is, again, in the early days of the administration when I do not know my way around. Billie Jean loves to, and I know this now about her, she is so great, salt of the earth. She loves to talk to whatever person is there, like the doorman or the uniformed division Secret Service guys. And in this case, when we finished lunch, she says, "Oh, I want to meet the guys in the mess." So the guy who was our server says, "Okay, I'll take you back." They disappear, right? They go through the door, they disappear. I have no idea. The note comes from the Oval to say, "The president is ready now," underlined, because you don't keep the president waiting. I don't know where the door to the mess is or how to get back there because I hadn't been back there. I can't find her, like literally cannot find her. So he was a little irritated when we first walked in. He clearly got over it, but he was, he was not happy with me. It was like just very tense moments when those sort of things happen. This is one of my favorite things is we did a panel on with the entire cast of Scandal. So that's Shonda Rhimes all the way at the end, and then the guy who plays the president. You see Kerry Washington in the middle. This was kind of like just fun, as a fun moment. We traveled to the Middle East with Conan O'Brien, and this is my team, having drinks with Conan. Conan came out, we did a visit to Qatar, and we went to LUD, which is really one of our largest Air Force bases, previously secret, now no longer secret. That is the Air Force base that controls all of the flight operations for the US military throughout the Middle East. And Conan went out there, did an amazing show for the troops, but also then did a whole show for his night show from the Air Force Base, which was very cool. And then this in 2016, one of our final events was we did a screening of oh God, I just blanked on the story on the movie. The movie about Katherine Johnson and the women who at NASA, right, who actually did the calculations, right, the Black women who were really behind, Neil Armstrong.
Figures.
Hidden Figures. Thank you. So this is the cast of Hidden Figures, Olivia Spencer and Taraji Henson and Janelle Monáe, with some of our team where we did an event, at the White House. And then was not all famous people, because I have to say, this is one of my most favorite photos and stories. This is from 2016 towards the end. And we were really trying to make sure that anybody who, hadn't been to the White House, we could get into the White House before our term ended. One of the things Mrs. Obama always wanted to stress was that we make sure that people knew that this was a home for them. It was the people's house. And so my team learned the story. The Washington Post had written a story about this woman who's a woman named Virginia McLaren. She's 104 at the time this photo was taken. And they did a story about her because she lived in Anacostia, about 1.5 miles from the White House. And at 104 was still a foster grandmother to kids in Anacostia. And so, but had never been to the White House. That was also in the story. And so we determined to, invite her to the White House. So she's standing in what's known as the Blue Room, and we usher her in where the president and first lady are waiting to take photos with folks. And what's happening in this picture is she was so excited when she came in. She goes up to Mrs. Obama. She says, "The first African-American first lady." And Mrs. Obama is pointing at the president saying, "Well, what about this guy?" So she gets an office. Of course, the first African-American president too, but she was more excited to see my boss, I have to say. And then this photo. So there's a series of photos coming up. And people ask, what's the most memorable day? It's hard to pick one memorable day. But a lot of us in the White House always talk about this particular day because it kind of represents some of the highs and lows of a day in the White House. So this is the day when, in June of 2015, where marriage equality was pronounced as the law of the land by the United States Supreme Court. And it was also a day we were going down to South Carolina. And so I had gone ahead, not flying out on Marine One, but had gone ahead with the staff to Air Force One because we had a delegation of members of Congress going down to South Carolina with us. So I went to greet those folks. And that's how I happened to be standing on Air Force One, which is where I am, standing next to John Lewis and to Elijah Cummings, both of whom we lost last year, watching the President of the United States. You can see him over Bobby Schmuck's shoulder there on the TV screen, announcing yet another civil rights moment in history, and advancement, with this other civil rights icon's arm around me. I mean, it's like amazing. That is like the particular photo is probably my most treasured photo out of my time at the White House, especially now having lost both Congressman Cummings and Congressman Lewis, and how important it is sort of now. But we were going to South Carolina because the president was going to speak at the eulogy for Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who you may remember was the reverend who was part of the pastor at the church in Charleston, South Carolina, where the Charleston massacre occurred. And so the president went down to speak at that eulogy in representing not just Reverend Pinckney, but the entire other 8 families who lost a loved one in that shooting. And this is the one where President Obama started singing Amazing Grace during the eulogy. And what's not, you didn't see after that is, as the president and Mrs. Obama did multiple times, was we spent another 2.5 to 3 hours with each family. And that particular, we did a lot. We did it tragically too many times, because if you think about it, we had to do this consoler-in-chief thing a lot. But in this particular one, I think we were all struck by the fact that each of those families were actually full of grace and joy and acceptance and forgiveness already just days after the shooting, that I think stayed with all of us. And then we flew back to DC. And what happened at the end of the night in DC, which folks did not know until the sun went down, but a few of us knew, was that this was what the White House looked like once the sun went down when we went back to DC. And the story behind this is 2 of our youngest staffers, a young staffer in Office of Public Engagement and a young staffer in the press office, came to me and Valerie and said, wouldn't it be cool if we lit the White House in the rainbow colors if we win the marriage equality case? And it took a little bit of courage to do that because, for whatever reason, I was the keeper of this decision on whether we light the White House or not. And the decision from the chief of staff to the president had been throughout our administration, we are not going to light the White House colors other than pink in October for breast cancer, and we put the red ribbon up for World AIDS Day, because we got tons of requests. Like, if we had acceded to every request, the White House would never be lit white. Honestly, it was like teal for this thing and purple for that thing. And so we decided, rather than pick among causes, to never do it. But this came. It actually turns out this is very hard to accomplish, to get actually the colors to separate like that. We actually had to find somebody to fund it, because it doesn't come for free, and we don't have any budget. We had to test it on the backside of the White House, unbeknownst to anybody. Like the press, we didn't want to see it. Most of the White House staff didn't know, and only a few of us knew about it. And then it just sort of came up like this, and it was great. There's like it was a Friday night. in the summer, a spontaneous party, literally, all the White House staff came out onto the South Lawn there. There was a party that developed, outside the gates on Lafayette Park. I witnessed more than one, wedding proposal being made that night. And, it turned out to be one of those iconic pictures of the year, all from these two young staffers, which I often tell as a story when I'm speaking to young audiences about the importance of speaking up as a young person. And then to Time's Up, and I'll try to go a little faster, through these, post White House. Many of you know I went back to a law practice, but I also happened to be in Los Angeles, coincidentally, in October of 2017, in the wake of the first Harvey Weinstein allegations or reporting about the rampant sexual harassment in the entertainment industry, and meeting with some folks I knew in the entertainment industry, was pulled into these early meetings among people like Shonda Rhimes and America Ferrera, Eva Longoria, Reese Witherspoon. Nina Shaw is an amazing entertainment lawyer who's also pictured here. They were all just meeting spontaneously about what to do now that this behavior by Harvey had been exposed. And the women very quickly wanted to turn pain into action. And I helped really put together the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which was the first thing that we announced famously on the Golden Globes red carpet, which provides legal support and PR support, for the survivors of sexual harassment in the workplace. And this is some of the stats of what we've been able to accomplish in the last 3.5 years. I think this slide is a little dated. It's about 6 months old. And it's housed actually at the National Women's Law Center, not at the part of Time's Up that I run, because we wanted the fund to be operated by legal experts. And so we are still responsible for funding it. We famously raised $24 million in that first moment after the red carpet, and we're going to go through a replenishment effort soon. But what we do is, we're working to stand for survivors of sexual harassment, but also to work to make sure it doesn't happen in the first place for workplaces. So it relates back to if you remember, I did that Working Family Summit. It's a through line to that and to my life as a single working mom, working on things like caregiving and childcare. The woman holding the baby in that tweet, you may have remembered this woman, Buffy Wicks, who was a California legislator who, during the pandemic, the California rules would not allow her to vote actually on a caregiving bill remotely. So she had to take her then, I think LA was like 6 weeks at that point, to drive to Sacramento, take her onto the floor to vote, this baby as she's nursing him. Buffy was one of my first deputies and staffers, and is now a member of the California legislature. So we continue to work with her on caregiving, and we also did like a big effort during the last election to support, not just to support women running for office, but to really call out racist and sexist and misogynistic reporting, especially as the run up to the election became clear that Joe Biden was going to pick a woman to be his running mate. We saw a lot of the coverage do this very quickly. The day after we issued this manifesto on the part of the women's community writ large that we were going to have her back as people ran, but not even knowing yet who the nominee would be. That was on a Friday, August 6th. The next day, Maureen Dowd wrote a column in the New York Times that likened the VP selection process to Walter Mondale giving Geraldine Ferraro a wrist corsage at the prom. Gets worse. Same day, the LA Times ran an article by another woman reporter who likened the VP sweepstakes to an episode of The Bachelor and the Oval Office as the ultimate fantasy suite. So, sort of demonstrated why we needed this campaign, which sort of had, just tons of pickup, throughout. We're now really active on caregiving. So the Biden-Harris proposal for Build Back Better includes an historic $1.5 trillion proposal to do caregiving. So these pictures of me are made in DC just last week. I went to my first trip to DC back there post-pandemic to participate in a national march of caregivers. So, and this is, building and making investments in childcare and elder and disabled care, and having a national paid leave policy. We are one of only 2 countries in the world without a national paid leave policy, and also supports for fair wages and supports for caregivers. And then I've also been talking a lot about, obviously, as I know you all have done several programs on what's happened around the surge in anti-Asian hate. And in what's going on around anti-Asian hate. And I sort of wrote this piece to get together with Jeanette Pai Espinoza, which was published sort of a couple, now I guess in May, that you can see at the end of Asian American Heritage Month. The thing about this particular thing is that Jeanette is a woman who runs Crittenden House, which is a great organization serving vulnerable girls. But Jeanette and I used to get confused when we were in DC all the time, to the point of which people would take and post on Twitter photos with Jeanette saying, "Oh, look, I got to take a photo with Tina Tchen." So the whole theme here was really about how that happens to all of us. People don't really see us. But that's a part of the problem, is that they don't really see us. They don't see us as individual. And that is actually, when you don't see the person and you don't see the humanity of the actual person, that's what makes it so easy to take a hammer to somebody's head, or to push them down, or to actually stab them. I mean, it's all part of the same thing. And I think that's it. So that's kind of just the real quick version. And I think I took up a lot of time, but I'm happy to answer, if folks want to stick around to do questions or anything else.
And we'll do questions live, or you can just type them in the chat.
Thank you, Tina.
Yep. Thank you, Tina. That was really awesome. Just thanks for the whole sweep of your life. Just really appreciate it.
Wow, thanks so much. I know my parents took a long time to become citizens, and I'm not sure exactly why, but when were these bills? When did your parents become citizens?
So it was after I was born. So that, that newspaper clipping, you'll note, is from when we moved to Cleveland. And we did not move to Cleveland until 1960. Sandy was born in 1959. And so from 59 to 60, we lived in Maryland. So it was actually probably Mabel 1961. So that, to what I know, and I haven't done like the deep work on this, my mother, there was a bill probably in 1960 or 61 that passed Congress that automatically converted the status of any Chinese student who was in the United States on a student visa. So if you were holding a student visa, you were automatically converted then to having a green card. And then you could go and pass to citizenship. My dad had come in on a visitor visa. He'd already graduated from medical school. So he came in on either a visitor visa or a work visa to do his residency, but he was not on a student visa. And so his citizenship actually required a piece of special legislation that named him by name, that the, interestingly, Republican senators from Ohio at the time sponsored. I have a copy of the legislation, and it was he and maybe a dozen other similarly situated Chinese immigrants were named by name, and that it took that act of Congress to convert their status individually.
Wow.
Wow, and they both became citizens the same year.
Right.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. There's a question in chat about, what do you think motivated you to get into gender equity issues?
Well, I think, Andrea, like I said, some of it was like happy circumstance, right? Was that landing in Springfield in that moment in time, in my, being 22, 23 years old, watching all this swirl of activity happening around me. Probably that is what gave me that crash course and caught me up in it. Although it was a little predisposed already, because part of my senior thesis, for my college years, had been studying three social movements, and one of those social movements was the getting women the right to vote. But I do remember when I was doing the research for that, like finding nothing. Like this is like 1978, and I can't find any resources, in the Harvard libraries to sort of do some of that work and that research. So I think all of those things kind of combined sort of got me into it early on and fueled it.
Thank you.
Other questions? I've got a question. So when I read your bio and I saw that you argued a case before the Supreme Court, and there was a link to the case with the recording. So I listened to it. And just because, it's just neat to listen. And I can't imagine how much prep it takes, because you have to be on the spot, because any justice can ask any question anytime, no matter what. I just want to know what kind of prep goes into getting ready for a Supreme Court case like that.
Yeah, crazy amount, Alan. You're absolutely right. Like, look, remember, I was an associate. I was an associate in the year I was going to be up for partner when I argued this. And I actually have to give a lot of credit to the woman who was the partner on the case, who let me argue it, because she'd never argued in the Supreme Court, and she's retired from practice, and so she was a federal judge at one point, but she's never argued a case in the Supreme Court. Most partners would have taken that for themselves, but I knew the case better, and I had argued the case in the appellate court, so she let me do it. And and it's crazy. Like you read every case, every possible case in your brief, in the other side's briefs over and over again. Because I was arguing on behalf of the state of Illinois, the National Association of Attorneys General actually offers to attorneys general the opportunity to get moot courted by people in DC who are Supreme Court practitioners. So my argument was like the Monday or Tuesday after Thanksgiving. So I came out the day after Thanksgiving, and that weekend, those folks mooted me, which was actually really helpful to do. I also went to the Supreme Court. Like I'd never been, like sort of like not going to the White House. I'd never been to the Supreme Court because the day that in my 8th grade visit to DC, I went to Mount Vernon, not to the Supreme Court that day. And so I actually flew out to sit in the chamber, which thank God I did, because it's really small. If you've ever visited the Supreme Court, the entire chambers is quite small. And then when you go past the visitors part of it into the well, as it's called, right, where the lawyers sit, you are like really close. You are like maybe 3 feet from the bench where the judges are. Justices are. There's no expectation of that. And then because there's 9 of them, they like encircle you. So you're literally almost in the middle of a half circle with them on either side. Had I seen that, which actually my opponent, he saw it the day that he walked in. And I know you could, if you heard the art, he was struggling a little bit. And I think it's just because being in the room is so intimidating. And I was actually able to at least get over that. But yeah, it's like a thing. It's a whole thing, Alan.
Amazing.
I loved all the photos. I'm just wondering, a lot of them seem very candid. And I'm just trying to figure, do they have a White House photographer who just follows everybody around?
Absolutely. So some of you might follow Pete Souza. If not, Souza, go on his Twitter feed at his Instagram account, Pete Souza, which is kind of hilarious. So Pete, and not just Pete, Pete's the most famous one, but there's actually a whole staff. So there were at least half a dozen, I think, photographers in addition to Pete who would cover each of us. So they would, we had a couple of people who were dedicated to covering the First Lady. There was always somebody with the president, both in private moments too, which is why you see things. So whenever we're moving, that's why there's pictures of us in the colonnade. Whenever we're going from an event to an event, there's always a photographer following us. They're not always clicking away, but when they see certain things happening, they're really good at it. They would know that this is a moment that even though we're just walking down the hallway, it's a good moment to catch, and they're really good at that. So Pete has now published 2 books of his White House photos. And the thing that you may know Pete from, which was kind of fun to do during the Trump years, is Pete started like trolling Donald Trump. Like he would take a photo, like if Trump had done something particularly outrageous that day, Pete would post a photo from, like if he'd done something outrageous, let's say with the Prime Minister of Japan, he would post a photo from President Obama's visit with the Prime Minister of Japan, which would have been very respectful. And it'd be like, this is the way to do it. So you got to look at his Twitter feed. It's hilarious. I'm not doing it justice. He actually published a whole book called Shade. So he's got one book that's just straight up my years in the White House. It's beautiful. Then he's got another book that was published about 2 years ago called Shade, which is all his like shade photos of Donald Trump using Obama photos of the time. Like he'd post photos of, the president and Mrs. Obama, like, being very, loving with each other, in contrast to whatever terrible thing went on between the Trumps, in that given moment or something like that. He's pretty funny. He's fun to look at.
Are they like backing up down the hall at the colonnade, like
yes,
watching you?
Exactly. And that's what they were doing, Mabel. And in the beginning, it's really, I remember in the early days, you're really conscious of it because you're in the room and you can hear this clicking going on and your picture's being taken and, there's a part of your head that's going, oh, hell, they're taking a picture of me and I look terrible. There's that. And then over time, you just sort of, you ignore it. You just don't even remember that it's happening. So you just kind of get used to it. But it's a wonderful record to have. On one of the presents I have every year, the president's gift to the senior staff and then the first lady's gift to our staff would be compilations of the year in photos. So we have these just private compilations, and one of the things the photographers took great pains to do, because you would see them show up towards the end of the year in about, early December. All of a sudden, the photographers would show up at some meeting that there really wasn't a reason for them to be in. And it was because they had determined that there was a staffer in that meeting for whom they did not yet have a photo to go into the book. So there'd be this mad scramble in the first week of December where the photographers are going out to try to figure out a way to get a photo of the staffer who's going to get the book, who doesn't have a photo otherwise, because that was actually very nice of them, because they made sure if you were on the senior staff and going to get a book that, you would get a photo in the book.
But if they went on vacation, they were out of luck.
Oh, I know. No, really. It was kind of like, it was like a thing. And mostly you kind of didn't want to tell the staffers. I mean, I knew that's what they were doing, right? Because we would talk about it, but you sort of don't want to tell somebody like, all right, we don't have any photos of you, so we're going to take you. You don't want to say that to somebody, right?
So make sure you're in the meeting.
Right. Well, sometimes I would find out about it because I would get told so to say, can you make sure this person's in the meeting? So like somebody like me, I could get them into a meeting to make sure that would happen.
All right, we're going to take a couple more pictures. I just want to give a plug, kind of dovetailing on your recent work. So we are offering a bystander training tomorrow afternoon for our adult heritage. They are going to put the link to the registration page in the chat. There's a couple more slots. I haven't checked in a couple days, but there's we have a couple more slots available. I did this training a couple months ago, and it's, God forbid we are in any way participating in some kind of an event, but probably we will be kind of seeing something happening. And this is produced by Asian Americans Advancing Justice here in Chicago. And they do a very nice job kind of giving us as just normal citizens things we can do other than watch, right? And things that we can do that can be constructive in support of the victim or the situation. The one I did was an hour, and it just wasn't enough time. So we're doing using the whole hour and a half of heritage, the adult heritage program tomorrow to give us time to digest the material, ask questions, and that kind of thing. So I think it's still available if you want to sign up and try and get in for the tomorrow session. That would be great. So the link is in the chat, and then there's a couple more questions.
I would also say, I think I would encourage everyone to sign up as individuals, because that way that gives them a better count of how many people are actually attending the training. So if you're 2 people in one household, it might be good to sign up both people just so they have a good count of how many people are attending their trainings.
Yep, great. I see one other question from Andrea. Insight you can give us into Michelle or Barack Obama's personalities, work styles that we may not know about.
So the first thing I will say is that, they are very much the same people behind the scenes as they are on what you see in front of the camera. I mean, I do think that's one of their particular appeals, is that they are very authentic and genuine across the board. But a couple things, it is so interesting about the two of them. They are very yin and yang. They are so opposite. So he is a very late riser, like woe to the person who would say, we need to have this meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning. Like there really were times when you could, the possibility for an 8 or 9 a.m. event would come up. We'd sit in the room and you could just see people's eyes go like, really? Like, do we have to do it? And who's going to go tell him that has to happen? He's very much he's a night owl. He'll be up late at night. So he reads, he gets briefing books like this, and he literally would read the whole thing every night because he stays up late, but then he does not get up early. His wife, however, is the exact opposite. She also reads all her briefing books that we sent, but she goes to bed really early. She gets up at 4 and she works out. So she, and she writes about this in Becoming too. She famously started that when the kids were little, because it was the only way she could work out, was she determined, 4 a.m. was when she could do it before everybody else in the house got up. And so she's kept that habit. So she's up, which is a little scary to be on her staff. I got it less so as chief of staff, but her body person and my deputy chief of staff, who did more of her personal scheduling, would get emails at like 6 a.m. for things, right? It's a little terrifying to get those. The other thing they're very different is he, because he's got this photographic memory, right? The man remembers everything. He's literally the smartest person I've ever met. And he was also very adept at last minute. So he didn't need his briefing memos very far in advance. He would work on his speeches, but you could make changes up to the last minute. I remember one terrifying moment. One of my jobs as chief of staff is we would accompany was very cool. You know, the two of us would accompany Mrs. Obama to the UN General Assembly when the president would give his speech, right, during the entire UN General Assembly, when the whole world assembles every September in New York at the UN, and every country's president gives a speech to the entire assembled ones. And the President of the United States goes right after Brazil. I can't remember why Brazil is ahead of us, but we're always after Brazil. And on the first morning of the meeting. And so we would go, and there was always a place for the spouse to sit in the audience. Melissa Winter and I would sit with her, but we would be behind the scenes, behind that big green podium that you see, that green marble thing for the UN. Behind there is the Secretary General's offices, and that's where the holding room is for the presidents of the countries as they come out to give the speech. One time we go there and we're sitting back there, and I swear to God, the national security staff are rewriting the speech as we speak. Like they're freaking out because they can't get the printer in the Secretary General's office to work, and they can't get the right version of the speech loaded into the teleprompter. And you have to have both, because you never know, as was the case in this, since the prompter did not have the full version of the speech, when the prompter is going to go down. So you have to have the right printed thing in front of them. And they're doing this. It's like, and Melissa, my deputy chief of staff, and me are looking at this thinking, no way in hell could you ever do this with Michelle Obama, because she required us, as I showed you the teleprompter in her office, we practiced her speeches. We had them locked weeks in advance of when she would have to give them. And, you know, and if we had that happen, had we been telling her we had to rewrite that, heads would roll. I mean, I will tell you, Barack Obama used to go with that all the time. And the interesting thing would happen was when we would do a foreign trip or some other joint trip, if it was a military trip, it happened on occasion that there would be really West Wing staff, or in the case of a foreign trip, it's the national security staff who would be responsible for briefing us and writing the briefing memos for the first lady and advising us and having input in the speech. And they all thought they could like waltz in and all do the briefing memo, like, you know, the day before the trip. It's like, oh, no. You have to start writing that briefing memo a week before the trip. And then you have to give us a revised one every day, because we send that to her every day for a week, sometimes 2 weeks if it was a big trip, before the event. And no, you cannot do the Barack Obama thing where you get to just finish your work like, you know, the day before. If you're working for Michelle Obama, you have to be way ahead. And it would inevitably take all of them like, I have to do what? I mean, they really could not get their heads around that. Even very senior people, we're talking about people like the Deputy National Security Advisor of the United States, is like, can't get her head around. That's what she's got to do.
That's great.
So with the UN thing, did he end up looking at the speech like on
Mabel,
on the monitor and memorize it?
He knew it. He's the smartest man I have ever met. So you would not know that this was a speech that had gotten key phrases, because anything that's changing that last minute is kind of important, right? That's why it's changing in the last minute. Nope. He and Ben had talked about it in the hotel. They talked about it in the car on the way over. Ben is still writing. Ben Rhodes, you know, is still writing it and trying to get it locked. It wasn't fully locked, and they were mostly freaking about the prompter, but, you know, he was very smooth. I think actually the prompter went out at that point. And so he was on paper, and then there's always this frantic moment where you're trying to get the prompter to catch up and do it. There's a funny story Mrs. Obama tells about her inauguration speech, and her convention speech in 2008. In Denver, when, you know, she's making her speech as the big moment in the convention. We're in the convention hall. And she was introduced by her brother at that. And we're not really fully adept at this, but she did practice that speech too ahead of time. I didn't know this. I wasn't on her staff yet. I was just a delegate sitting in the audience. And but what Craig says, when Craig tells the story, her brother, you know, is he's introducing her, but as they're passing each other and giving the hug, Craig is whispering to her, right prompter out. Because the prompter on the right side had completely gone out. So Craig's like giving her the subtle right prompter out. But she was good. I don't think if you go back and you look at that one, I don't think she's only looking to the left. I think she is still continuing to do the thing where you're not really seeing that she's looking at the prompter. But yeah.
Wow.
Hey, Tina,
Well,
can you tell, are we done? Then my
go ahead,
question.
Dorothy, and then I'll finish up with the final question, but go ahead.
I just
Dorothy.
want to ask, what was the impact on your children of having to juggle, you know, this intense work schedule at the White House with trying to raise a family?
Yeah, no, good question. Well, Patrick was older. So Patrick was already in college. in 2009 when we moved. So I remember when I was talking to them saying, okay, we might do this. He says, well, I'm already in school. So he said, but you can't sell the house. You can move to DC if you want. I'm already in school, but you can't sell the house because they love this house in our neighborhood. So of course that I didn't do. So, but Emma is the one who really had the impact, right? She's 12 years old in the middle of 6th grade. And that was hard. It was really hard, right? Any of you guys who've moved a kid, it's hard. Like she was still crying come April, in the middle of the night, it was really sad. But then she acclimated. And the saving grace was our nanny who was working for us in Chicago, came with us and stayed for 6 years. I mean, Sophie, wow. Came and was going to stay a year. And she wound up staying for 6 until Emma graduated from high school. Wow. And that, Dorothy, is the only way I could have done it because you're right that the hours are unpredictable. The travel was, unpredictable. I had it easier in working for the First Lady. I don't know that I could have lasted all 8 years working in the West Wing because those hours are more punishing. She at least, because Sasha and Malia's schedules were preeminent, she'd go down for the weekend. We rarely had weekend events. We rarely had to deal with breaking news, right? We weren't responsible for breaking news. The West Wing folks would have to respond to a shooting or something happening overseas or, that. And so that schedule was actually more livable than probably being a West Wing staffer would be.
Wow. All right, well, we're gonna wrap it up. I'm selfishly gonna ask you 2 final questions. One is, I'll give credit for the last 4 years. It made me a much better citizen. I mean, really, what does it take to be a real citizen, And I'm always looking for tips, like what can we do as citizens to be better citizens? So I wanted to throw that at you. The other one is something we've been kind of tossing to all of our, elder speakers and distinguished guests is what lessons have you learned about your life that you'd like to just give back to us at camp?
Ooh, that one's harder. Since you guys all know me, that one's like a little harder.
Yeah.
There's like
throw a zinger at the end. Come on.
Really new. The first one I will take on because it is. I'm grateful to you, Alan, for sort of being that candid, right, about your own coming to this, because. Look, so much of the American public really isn't, I'm an outlier, really. Those of us who are true junkies and always had cable news on every day, are a bit of an outlier. And, we still, voter participation in this country, even as high as it was last year, it was still only like 60% or 65% and way under that in a lot of places. So these critical decisions, and you can see the difference. I mean, that's the thing the last 4 years taught you is that elections really do matter. It doesn't, you can't just casually sit back and say it doesn't really matter who's the mayor, or it doesn't really matter who's president of the United States. It really does matter. And so, everybody really has to, at the very least, go out and vote. You have to, at the very least, no matter what these voter suppression laws are real and they're bad. And I will give you my, analysis, which is not my analysis. It actually comes from Sherilyn Eiffel. And Sherilyn, she gave this analysis 3 years ago, actually, so it's not a current one. But she said, we were actually at a diversity conference where diversity was getting celebrated in Hollywood, and we're going to be a majority minority country, in 10 years, which is true. But she said, look, there is such a thing as white minority rule. It has existed on the planet. It has existed in our lifetimes on this planet, in South Africa. And don't think that the folks who, aren't also watching the demographics, and don't think that, white male people in power don't see what's coming and that they aren't taking steps to put white minority rule into place in this country. And she said the ways they did it are they gerrymandered electoral districts, they controlled the courts, and they suppressed the vote. All 3 things are in the works right now. That is what's happening. That's the voter suppression laws. The courts are gone. I mean, so the courts really are lost. That is clear that for a generation, we can no longer count on the federal courts as engines of civil rights improvement. It's just done. It's gone. And we're just going to have to really control the ballot box and be active there. And so, it's really important to be registered. It's really important to know what the rules are and adhere to whatever they are, because, and stand in however long a line you need to. to vote, because that's what they're going to do, and to help other people do it, to fund candidates and organizations that are going to work for it, because it's really important and it really matters, and to be informed of the issues like along the way. Like right now, even though we're not in an election cycle, it's really important for people to tell their members of Congress that they really want caregiving investments, and you really want, you need them, that you can't find, if you can't, even if those of us who are lucky enough to have means can afford to hire caregivers, everybody's got hard, I mean, even, we've all got a hard time finding caregivers. Well, why do we have a hard time finding caregivers? Because we don't invest in caregiving as an industry or as a profession. That is a legacy of slavery. So what you may not know is that caregivers as a profession are not subject to the same wage and hour protections as the rest of us, because they were specifically, domestic workers were specifically left out of the New Deal when it passed back in the 30s. And they've remained outside of those protections, those wage and hour protections and labor protections. They don't have a right to organize. That's why, they're making like $8 an hour to do really hard work. And it always goes back all the way to slavery, when you didn't have to pay for domestic work. And that it's 2021, and that is still the condition. And as a result, we can't find caregivers because nobody wants to go in the profession, because it's not invested in, and yet we all need it, right? So 70% of us, who are now senior citizens, as many of us are, because all of us who are about the same age and growing up together, like 70% of us will need caregiving, right? During some point of our life. And it's that, but that's happening right now, and it's important to speak up about that to your elected leaders, or whatever the Asian hate issue, that's, thank God for Tammy Duckworth and Mazie Hirono that got through, but we need to kind of support that and continue to keep that going.
All right. Any tips for family campers on living a great life? Anything you like to finish up with? Last words.
Well, I will just say that bit that I have at the beginning of my speech, which literally, you guys, it really is the speech that I give when people want, they want like the story of my life. Family camp is always a part of it, and I have over the years come to appreciate even more as I've thought about it and reflected on the inputs to my life that sort of brought me to where I am today. That family camp, guys, I'm not going to start crying. Family camp is a really big part of it, in ways that I will say that I've only probably in the last several years come to deeply appreciate and articulate in the way that I do now. Because as I listen to other Asian colleagues of mine who feel less connected, the same background, and, had sort of, just struggles with their own identity over the years and lack of connection. And I didn't feel that. And, I had great parents, but I got to tell you guys, family camp was a really big part of that. Really was. It was a really big part of, as a fully assimilated, don't speak Chinese, Asian American myself, having my kids be connected to Patrick and Emma's connection to their own heritage. A lot of that comes from, the years that they got to spend and the connection they still feel to family camp. So, and Alan, you and Alyssa and Lawrence and, Dorothy and Frank and Eric, I mean, you guys who really like kept it going during the lean years when a lot of us weren't like showing up and traveling around Ohio and other places, did a tremendous service for the rest of us, who are able to still enjoy the blessings of family camp, seriously, for our kids and for our grandkids. So, thank you for doing that and for keeping it. And really it's what our parents did, right? Like the foresight of our parents is sort of remarkable, and what they did in creating that.
Yep, that's great. So Tina, thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank you,
Tina.
Tina. Good to see you, Tina.
All right, that concludes another great session of WAWA CU. I'm going to stop the recording so we can go off the record. You can say anything you want now.